so happy that I can finally share with you my favorite sock recipe. I have been knitting socks for the past couple of years, and I've tried many different methods, many different needles, many different yarns, and after many trials and error, I came up with one recipe that works great for my feet. And I thought that maybe for those of you that might have been knitting socks for a little while and might want to learn maybe new techniques, new tips that they don't know yet, or if you have yet to try your hands at knitting socks and you don't really know where to start, I thought that I could share this little tutorial with you, and maybe 20 is gonna be the year of the sock for you. Who knows? Before we get into our tutorial, I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. The sock that I'm going to be knitting today is worked over 64 stitches, which is the number of stitches that work for my foot in that needle size and in this type of yarn. So this is a fingering weight yarn. It's slightly heavier than a regular 4-ply yarn, I would say, but even for most fingering weight yarns, I cast on 64 stitches on a 2.5 millimeter needle. I tend to be a tighter knitter because I'm a thrower, which means that I knit the European style by throwing the yarn and holding the yarn in my right hand instead of in my left hand, which means that I do tend to knit tighter. So in order to make my socks fit me best, I cast on this number of stitches and get a really nice fabric with this combination without having the fabric too tight on my foot, which used to happen a lot on a 2.25 millimeter needle. So what you want to achieve with socks is a finished pair that is about 10% smaller, both in length and leg circumference of your foot, in order for it to fit nicely. If it's too loose, it's going to be baggy in your shoe, and there's going to be more friction and it's not going to be comfortable. And on the other end of the spectrum, if it's too tight, there's not going to be enough elasticity, and therefore the sock is not going to be comfortable as well. So it's just finding the right balance with many factors, actually: your gauge, the yarn that you use, the needles, also the way you knit. But we're gonna keep things very simple today, and I'm just gonna share the sock that fits me. But I just wanted to let you know that you might have to adapt that recipe to your foot, which means that you might have to cast on less stitches. You might have to go down or up a needle size. You might have to use another knitting method than the one that I use, because this is not comfortable for your hands. So this is just a starting point for your own knitting journey. And if you want to read more about socks, knitting, and sock theory, I would highly recommend you to check out Clara Park's The Knitter's Book of Socks, which is a really wonderful resource to have if you want to get into sock knitting. In this tutorial, I'm gonna share the different techniques that I use, and you're gonna be able to find some timestamps in the description box below. So if you don't want to watch all of the knitting that is happening and you just want to get into the techniques, you can simply scroll down and check the timestamp, and you're gonna be able to get to the part that you want to watch. So as I have said, I am casting on with a 9-inch circular in a 2.5 millimeter needle. That needle size might work for you, it might not work, your gauge might be completely off. You will find information for my gauge below, which is important if you want to achieve the correct size for your foot, which means that if you want to achieve the measurements that I got for this sock sample, I would highly recommend you to get a gauge that is as close to mine as possible. There's many ways to knit socks, but in this particular video, I'm going to be using the 9-inch circulars, which are my favorite needles to knit socks. If you are new to 9 inches circular needles and you are interested in giving them a try, I would highly recommend you to trying them out and see if you like them yourself or not. As always in knitting, there's two schools. There's people that feel very comfortable using them, and there's people that despise them because they require a little bit of practice. If you, depending on how you knit, how you tension your yarn, the stitches that you use, they might be comfortable for your hands or they might not. And to be honest, it took me at least 1.5 months to get used to them. Don't tend to cramp while knitting at all, even though sometimes I knit for up to 8 hours. But these needles kind of got my hands crampy quite quickly, and I didn't want to stop using them because I knew that they could really help my knitting, my sock knitting journey. So I kept working with them, and now I absolutely love them. So anyways, back to the knitting. The first method that we're going to be looking into is the German twisted cast on, which is a relatively elastic cast on, which is wonderful for knitting socks because it gives you enough elasticity for putting the sock on, but it's not too loose and it's not too tight, and it's a very comfortable cast on for socks in particular. So this is the cast on method that I use for all of my socks. If you are working with a striped yarn and you want your two socks to match perfectly, I would highly recommend you to stop working on the leg portion at the end of the collar section. The heel flap is worked in the contrasting color and is worked over the first set of 32 stitches only. So what we're gonna do is we are going to use the spare needle, the 9-inch circular, leaving the last set of 32 stitches on the working needle and setting them aside. As you can see, the previous decrease that we made created a gap in the work. So in order to close that gap, we're gonna do another decrease with an SSK, which is a slip knit with the stitch that is before the gap and the stitch that is after the gap. So we're gonna knit them together basically, and therefore it will close the gap. As you can see, the direction of the knitting is changing because the heel is starting to appear. So we're gonna keep working in this way, slipping the first stitch, knitting across the row, and SSK one stitch before the gap, then SSK, knit one, then turn the work. On the wrong side, we're gonna slip the first stitch, purl across to one stitch before the last gap, purl two together, purl one, then turn the work. And we're gonna work in this fashion until all of our 32 stitches have been worked. At this point, we are going to resume working in the round, which means that we are going to pick up stitches. Then we're going to knit across the 32 leg stitches, which means that the stitches that were put on hold are going to end up on the spare needle, which we're going to be using throughout the foot portion of the sock up until the toe decreases. Since we decrease so many stitches in order to shape the heel and to resume working it around, we're going to need to pick up stitches. So we're going to pick up the stitches that are located in between the garter bumps that were created at the very end and very beginning of the heel flap. We're going to start by breaking the contrasting color yarn and attaching the main color yarn and start picking up stitches alongside the first edge of the heel flap, picking up 18 stitches in total, and we're going to pick up one extra stitch at the very top of the foot, knitting that stitch through the back loop in order to close the gap. Then we're going to place a first marker, which is going to separate our leg stitches from the gusset stitches that need to be decreased. So our first marker is right after our first decrease. Then we're going to knit across the 32 leg stitches, then place our second marker. We're going to pick up and knit through the back loop another stitch at the very top of the sock to close the gap. Then pick up and knit in between the garter bumps are 18 stitches. Then knit 9 stitches, place a marker of a different color or a different shape to indicate the beginning of the round. I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video and help me bring you this little stock tutorial. Skillshare is an online learning community for creatives where millions come together to take the next step in their creative journey. Skillshare offers thousands of inspiring classes for creative and curious people on topics including illustration, design, photography, video, freelancing, and more. The class that I took today to keep me company as I was working on a new design is digital collage, finding inspiration in shapes and colors. If you are watching this video, it means that maybe you want to take on socks knitting in 2020, but maybe you are planning to start new creative ventures as well. Skillshare is offering you a 2-month free of premium membership to explore your creativity. And then an annual subscription is less than $10 a month. So make sure to click on the link in the description box below. Almost there. So you're gonna stop the foot at about 2 inches smaller than your actual foot, and we're gonna start the toe decreases. So the very first step that you want to do is to cut your working yarn, and then you're gonna attach the contrasting yarn, which we're gonna be using till the end. We are almost there. There's only one very last step that you need to do and your socks are done. So this part is called the kitchen stitch, and this is a very secure method to close the toe. What you will need for this step is a tapestry needle. So what you want to make sure of is that your needle is divided in two, just as you see. So as if you were going to knit with the magic loop method, the very first set of 14 stitches is going to be on your first needle, and the second set on the back needle with the working yarn attached at the back of the work. So we're going to break the working yarn, leaving a tail of a couple of inches. You don't need a whole lot of yarn for that, but just make sure that you have a tail that is long enough to cover all of the stitches that we are gonna be working, and a little bit extra for weaving in your ends. So we're gonna thread our tapestry needle with the working yarn. Then we're gonna have a 2 steps setup So the very first step is to insert the tapestry needle through the first stitch on the front needle as if to purl, leaving the stitch on the needle. Then we're going to insert the tapestry needle through the first stitch on the back needle as if to knit, leaving the stitch on the needle. And now we're going to start the Kitchener stitch, which is a 4 steps process that is going to be repeated to the end. Step 1. Insert the tapestry needle in the first stitch as if to knit, taking the stitch off the needle. Step 2. Insert the tapestry needle through the second stitch on the first needle as if to purl, leaving that stitch on the needle. Step 3. Insert the tapestry needle into the first stitch on the back needle as if to purl, taking that stitch off the needle. Step 4. Insert the tapestry needle through the second stitch on the back needle as if to knit, leaving that stitch on the needle. These are the 4 steps that are going to be repeated. So the way I like to think of that, because you need to keep track of what you do, so make sure that you're not being disturbed while doing this, because it might be a little bit tricky to know where you stopped exactly. So a little tip that I can give you to remember, or to get into a rhythm rather, is to repeat 1, 2, 3, 4. So you know that number 1 is the first stitch on the needle, then step number 2 is the second stitch on the first needle, step number 3 is the first stitch on the back needle, and step 4 is the second stitch on the back needle. So repeat these numbers in your head, and that might help you to get into a rhythm and remember where you stopped, hopefully. That's it, your socks are done. You only need to block them now, which means that you're gonna give them a gentle little bath to relax all of the stitches and make them all cozy and lovely. So we're just gonna use a little bit of wool wash, soak them in warm water for 15 minutes, then roll them into a towel, squeeze the water out, leave them to dry flat or on sock blockers, and that's it. You're good to go and wear your socks. So I really hope that you enjoyed this little tutorial, that maybe you learned a few new tips here and there, or that maybe you've already completed your first pair of socks. So let me know in the comments down below. Thank you so much for watching once again, and happy sock knitting. I will be linking a couple of my sock patterns below if you are interested. So see you very soon.